Friday night felt ordinary until it did not. Midtown, late evening, neon lights slicing the rain. Two black men sat at a corner table, quiet, watching the room with the kind of calm that made other patrons think they were just regulars. What no one knew was how wrong that assumption would be. The clock struck 11. 3 off-duty police officers moved through the bar like they owned the air. Their voices were low at first, and then sharp. A night that looked like routine socializing folded into an allegation of aggression. There would be a recording, witnesses, a formal complaint, and a chain of accountability that would blow the case wide open. If you want to see how ordinary arrogance met accountability in ways the officers never expected, stay with this account to the end. The bar smelled of spilled beer and frying oil. The jukebox hummed a distant jazz tune. Eddie wiped a glass with a rag and watched with eyes that had seen trouble arrive before it made the first sound. Maria at the counter tightened a braid and pretended not to look. At the table sat Marcus and Malcolm Turner, identical faces, different uniforms. Marcus had the steady bearing of a municipal police captain who handled bureau politics with a practiced calm. Malcolm wore a plain shirt but carried himself with the silent readiness of a commander SEAL who had spent years in operations where silence was strategy. They did not advertise who they were. That night, that decision to sit and be anonymous placed them in the middle of a confrontation that would test the limits of power and the value of proof. "Move your hands," said Reed, one of the 3 officers, planting himself at the rim of the table. His voice had the clipped tone of someone used to giving orders. He smelled like aftershave and cigarette smoke. Diaz, taller, leaned a shoulder against the booth and laughed in a way that tried to make the room smaller. Harris, the 3rd, scanned faces as if looking for approval. Their approach was an aggression disguised as enforcement. They pointed at a napkin on the table, then at the twins, then at a piece of perceived disrespect. The language was brisk, voices rose, words became the first blows. Marcus answered first, measured. "We are not looking for trouble." The sentence was spare. Malcolm's hand brushed the table once, a small signal. The bar's ambient noise sharpened. Eddie's rag stilled. Maria's breath was audible behind the counter. Outside, a passing car hissed on wet asphalt. Reed leaned forward. "You think you can sit here and disrespect a cop?" he said. "We are asking you to move." Marcus did not flinch. "We are paid customers," he said. "We will leave if asked politely. We will not be intimidated." The exchange had the structure of interrogation. The tension rose because there was power behind the tone. Onlookers began to record with phones. A feeling in the room shifted from indifference to a low, humming watchfulness. The argument escalated into terse challenges. "Who are you people to talk back?" Diaz snapped. "You do not get to tell us how to act." Malcolm stood now, the muscles in his neck visible, the scent of his cologne cut by an old leather jacket. He spoke quietly but with an edge. "We asked for respect. That is not the same as defiance." Reed's hand moved toward a hip. A regular nearby, Malik, muttered under his breath and then held up his phone. "Hey, calm down," Tanya, a server, said. "Keep it cool." Harris, losing patience, reached across the table and put a hand near Marcus's shoulder. Marcus touched the hand in a non-aggressive manner and said, "Hands off us." The small contact was enough to ignite accusation. "You touched an officer," became the flashpoint. The crowd held its breath. Silence followed, thick as rain on the window, and in that silence the twins exchanged the smallest of looks. It was not a look of fear, it was coordination. Marcus's eyes flicked to the exit, and then to Maria, who nodded almost imperceptibly. Malcolm's jaw tightened. The 2 men had a history that explained actions without declaring intent. Marcus had spent years climbing departmental ladders, negotiating contracts, de-escalating street protests, and carrying the mark of being a public face under scrutiny. Malcolm had moved in clandestine operations, trained in circumnavigating danger, and returning with stories told in half sentences. Their backstories arrived like slow thunder. hidden in the way their jackets fell on shoulders and the economy of their words. The other patrons could not know. The officers could not guess. But a witness named Samir, who worked in the adjacent boutique and had seen the twins leave earlier some nights, leaned forward and kept filming. The crowd murmured as the officers stepped outside to the small parking lot behind the bar. The night air hit them with the smell of diesel and wet concrete. The street lamp threw long, thin shadows. The space isolated the actors. Tension became a current. Reed's voice rose, and the word resist appeared in the charged air. Marcus's tone lowered. "This is unnecessary," he said. "We can take this inside and talk." Diaz laughed and used the word assault as though it were a badge he could pin on anyone. The scene became physical when Harris shoved against Malcolm's chest. The shove was not violent, but it was a statement. Malcolm stepped back, and his foot skirted a puddle. The water splashed, reflecting the fluorescent light and the tight faces of the men. Maria watched from the doorway, the taste of bitterness in her mouth. Dialogue outside had to be shown in full. "You are not going to push me," Malcolm said. "We did not do anything." "You made a move," Reed replied. "You tried to touch an officer." "I put my hand on your wrist to stop you from grabbing my brother," Marcus answered. "You will."
"See, we have witnesses. Witnesses do not matter if we say otherwise," Diaz shot back. "We have status." Marcus looked at the phones in the hands of onlookers and said, "Then let them speak." The exchange ran 8 rounds, each sentence a measured escalation, each answer a deflection or a test. The sounds of shoes, rain on metal, an involuntary clink of a keychain punctuated the words. At one point, Marcus asked, "Do you want a complaint filed?" Reed smirked and said, "You would not like the paperwork." The implication was a threat. The twins smiled without humor. What the officers underestimated was the ability of ordinary objects to become evidence. Malik's video from inside the bar showed the initial approach. Tanya's phone at a table captured the shove. Samir had a second angle from a street-level perspective. Maria recorded the entire transfer into the parking lot. The sound on the videos captured not only words, but breathing, the scrape of fabric, the metallic note of a belt buckle. These filmings would multiply into a packet of evidence. A formal complaint would be lodged within 48 hours. By the time the confrontation spilled back toward the bar, the phrase, "filming is evidence," had taken on a literal meaning. There were memories braided into the present that explained why the twins reacted as they did. Marcus had grown up in the neighborhood. He remembered his father teaching him to speak softly, but to stand tall. He had risen through the ranks with a reputation for methodical procedure and a habit of keeping records. Those habits traced back to a trial when he had once been the only black supervisor in a precinct and had to document every encounter to defend his squad. That memory sat in his chest like a ledger, organizing risk into sentences. Malcolm's past was different. He had left home to train in special operations. He had been in places where weightless seconds decided life and death. He had come back with a bone-deep awareness of angles and distance and how people could turn suddenly hostile. Both men had backstories that formed 3 paragraphs each in their minds. Marcus felt the taste of cafeteria coffee at the academy, the smell of old paper in incident logs, the echo of a judge's question in a disciplinary hearing. Malcolm recalled the metallic clang of helicopter rotors, the salt in his mouth after long days at sea, the numbness in his hands after operations. Those memories were not told in full sentences to anyone in the bar, but they governed each move. They added context and nuance that would later be crucial to an investigation and to a debate about ethics. The fight did not erupt into a cinematic brawl. It was a series of controlled physical moves designed to prevent harm and to document abuse. Marcus blocked an arm, Malcolm pivoted to create distance, and together they guided an officer to the ground with techniques that incapacitated, without injuring. The motion was efficient, clinical, and precise. "Stand down," Marcus ordered. "We are securing this so no one gets hurt." Another phone angle from a delivery driver showed the maneuver in crisp detail. the air filled with the metallic scent of adrenaline. A witness named Lena Ortiz, a public defender who had been in the bar for a late meal, ran to the twins and shouted for someone to call the precinct watch desk. The twin movements were over in 30 seconds, but their effects rippled outward. Reed's hand pressed against concrete. Diaz coughed. Harris staggered. The accusation of assault turned on its head as the raw footage preserved the sequence. In the aftermath, the procedural part of the narrative began. Someone called 911 and an internal affairs number. The phrase "formal complaint" floated through the phone calls. An officer from the downtown precinct arrived to take statements. Investigator Samir Khan took notes with a pen that left a faint scratch. The first visible institutional reaction was suspension with pay for the involved officers pending an internal investigation. The video files were duplicated, time-stamped, and uploaded to cloud storage. The prosecutor who would later handle the case, Lena Ortiz, reviewed the initial packet and pronounced the evidence compelling. The community started to react. Posts that called the incident harassment by officers accumulated views and then went viral. The viral spread did not change facts, but it focused attention, and attention drives process. The twin roles as Officer Captain and as Commander SEAL complicated the story legally and ethically. The public wanted explanation. The department needed to answer. The legal theater that followed required many spoken scenes. Marcus gave a recorded statement with a calm, professional tone. "I did not provoke anyone," he said. "There was an attempt to intimidate." The prosecutor asked precise questions. "Did you touch an officer first?" she asked. "No," Marcus replied. "I placed my palm on his forearm to prevent escalation." Malcolm answered in his statement with brevity. "I acted to prevent harm," he said. The questioning contained 9 back-and-forth exchanges in which every answer was chosen to align with procedure. On the other side, Reed, Diaz, and Harris were interviewed, and their accounts diverged from the film's in ways that the investigator flagged. "He lunged at me," Reed said. "He tried to disarm me." The investigator played Malik's interior footage. The officer's narrative frayed against the objective feed. Each exchange in those interviews uncovered discrepancies. The sense of accountability grew because evidence began to create an objective scaffold. There were moments of maximum tension that became turning points. One such moment came when a clip cut from the bar to the parking lot and showed a hand on a shoulder. The audio recorded the sentence, "You will respect us." The phrase embodied a belief in unchecked authority and provoked a visceral reaction online. Another moment of tension occurred when a departmental press conference released a sanitized version of events, and the sanitized version collided with the raw film. The community reacted with outrage and a chorus of named witnesses who had posted their angles. A third moment of tension arrived when the city inspector announced that a pattern of complaints existed against the officers in question. Those moments ran together, and each was described in 2 paragraphs, producing a tight pulse of reaction. The narrative used sensory detail each time. The metallic ring of a phone, the texture of wet pavement under shoe soles, the taste of coffee swallowed quickly in the precinct. Those concrete notes kept the story anchored, while legal and ethical arguments expanded. As the investigation unfolded, more characters entered the scene and names accumulated. Eddie gave a statement and testified about the initial approach. Malik's footage was authenticated by a lab technician named Priya, who described the chain of custody. Tanya submitted her phone as evidence and later spoke with a reporter named Jordan. Sergeant Harold Mitchell provided internal records that showed prior complaints had been filed against one of the officers. Prosecutor Lena Ortiz convened a meeting with investigator Samir Khan and civil rights attorney Rosa Alvarez to plan charges and civil remedies. Each person contributed testimony, and each witness shaped the process in a particular way. Social media accounts run by local journalist Dana Lee amplified the videos and reached a national audience. Comments tracked the arc from local injustice to public scandal. The witnesses were not all sympathetic. Some called the twins provocateurs. Others called them protectors.
That mixture made the case real and complicated. The departmental response had to mimic the weight of public scrutiny. The chief announced a temporary suspension of the 3 officers and placed them on administrative leave pending a full investigation. The mayor publicly requested a full independent review. The prosecutor filed a formal complaint that included charges for misuse of authority and harassment. The word ethics circulated in editorials. Civil rights groups demanded transparency and accountability. The videos were cataloged by timestamps and cross-referenced with bar receipts and surveillance footage from the block. Forensic analysts examined the audio to determine who had spoken first. The process was slow and meticulous, and the language used in official documents emphasized procedure over rhetoric. The twin identities complicated public perception. Many saw Marcus as an internal actor and Malcolm as a veteran with operational legitimacy. That duality raised legal questions about conflict of interest and bias. As the footage moved through public channels and gained traction, it became viral. Within 48 hours, the phrase Turner Bar incident trended locally and then nationally. Clips were shared by local news outlets and then picked up by national programs. The increase in views produced phone calls to the mayor's office. A petition gathered signatures calling for a federal inquiry because patterns of similar complaints existed in the region. The viral spread translated into tangible consequences. 2 officers were placed on indefinite suspension. 1 faced criminal charges for assault. The police
department announced policy reviews and promised updated training about de-escalation and recording consent. A labor union representative asked for due process and cautioned against rushes to judgment. The prosecutor moved carefully but publicly, indicating that the volume of corroborated evidence made the likelihood of indictment real. Community reactions were varied and vocal. At a town hall meeting, Marcus spoke in a room that smelled of coffee and old chairs. He said, "We sought only to be safe. We sought to document." Malcolm spoke about duty and restraint. "I have seen worse," he said softly. "I have seen when silence becomes complicity." Rosa Alvarez, the civil rights lawyer, urged that the case be used to build systemic change rather than to feed grievance. Eddie and Maria testified about the mood of the bar and about the shift brought by the filming. Dana Lee published an investigative piece tracing prior complaints and the municipal response. That piece contained maimed accounts from community leader Tanya, from witness Malik, from investigator Samir, and from prosecutor Ortiz. The named network of secondary characters turned the incident into a communal story. What followed were institutional decisions that mattered. The department formed a reform committee. The mayor allocated funds for body cameras and for independent civilian oversight. The prosecutor filed charges where the evidence supported criminal accountability. There were settlements offered to patrons who had been harmed in prior encounters. The Internal Affairs report cataloged failures in training and flagged a need for mandatory ethics classes. Those consequences were concrete. They were also narrated in charts and press releases and discussed in council meetings. The official language emphasized investigation, evidence, and the rule of law. But underneathly, the emotional work of the community was to process a sense of betrayal and to rebuild trust. The epilogue showed 3 temporal snapshots that recorded change. 6 months after the incident, the suspended officers had been either reassigned or dismissed after the departmental review confirmed patterns of harassment. The captain who had been implicated in the initial press conference resigned from a supervisory position. A federal inquiry opened into the precinct's practices. 1 year later, the city council enacted new accountability measures that included civilian oversight panels, expanded training on aggression and de-escalation, mandatory reporting of complaints, and a public online portal for evidence submission. Community clinics taught citizens how to safely document interactions and how to file a formal complaint. 2 years on, the twins had different stations in life. Marcus had retired from active municipal oversight and had taken a position advising on ethics training, using his experience to reshuffle policies from within. Malcolm returned to the Sion, temporary assignment, and then took a role training new recruits in restraint and documentation. Both men spoke at public forums about the power of evidence and the responsibilities that come with authority. For the bar, the change was both practical and symbolic. Eddie implemented a policy to place evidence kiosks behind the counter where patrons could upload footage for
safekeeping. Maria organized a community group that met monthly to discuss policing and neighborhood safety. The final moral was simple and practical. A single act of filming did not itself create truth, but it created a record that, when combined with witness statements and procedural diligence, forced an institution to answer. The case did not erase pain. It did not remove every instance of harassment from the streets. What it did do was show that accountability becomes plausible when citizens document, when prosecutors pursue, and when institutions accept that ethics and transparency are not optional. If you want to follow more stories where everyday observation collides with public power and leads to real consequences, subscribe to see how evidence shapes accountability and how communities rebuild trust when procedures finally align with justice.